All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mike Light. I'm the chair of the Social Science Department, and I wanted to thank you all for attending our annual Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference. Today's speaker is going to be a treat for you. Dr. Dillon Carr, who's a professor of anthropology here at GRCC. He's a regular contributor to this symposium that we put on. And if you haven't ever had him for class, you should take his class because, in my humble opinion, I think he's one of the best teachers that I've ever seen. So he's not only instructive and enlightening, but he will cause you to think deeply about some of these issues that are important to us. So today's topic fits in nicely with the theme of some of the other things that have been going on this week. This is a week-long event for us. It culminates really tomorrow night with Matt Taibbi's lecture at Fountain Street Church, which we co-host with the Diversity Learning Center. So if you have some time tomorrow night and you'd like to follow up on issues of race and inequality that are going to be presented to you today, I would encourage you to attend that lecture as well. There's more information on our website. Just go to grcc.edu and look at the social science department. So without much further information from me, let's give Dr. Dillon Carr a round of applause.
Thank you, Mike. Is the mic working? Good? All right. See, I'm not above shameless pandering. So enroll for anthropology courses. I got a glowing review from Professor Light. And according to my wife, it's the best class you can possibly take. So I take that for what it's worth. Well, that's good. But I'm going to pander for other people as well. So one of the great parts about being here at GRCC as an institution is the Race and Ethnicity Conference that the Social Science Department hosts every year. It's wonderful to participate in both as a speaker and as just a faculty member, really being able just to see a number of very nationally prominent speakers come to campus and really talk about a concerted sort of theme involving race, ethnicity, and identity issues. And so this is really only just one installment in many of them. A lot of you are probably in here because you're forced to go to multiple ones of these. But for those of you who have sort of just wandered in out of interest, I'd just like to let you know about some of the other ones in here. We still have two wonderful geographers that are speaking on tonight at 7 o'clock in this room, and then Thursday night at 7 o'clock in this room. We'll have a couple different presentations on that. And then our keynote address, as Professor Light already talked about, is Matt Taibbi, who will be speaking down at the Fountain Street Church. And if you're stuck during the day, then you can come back and hear me again on a different topic with Professor Abid. So that's what's coming up. And so that's my shameless pandering with that, which took up a number of times. So it's encouraging to see a packed audience. What that tells me is I'm worth a lot of extra credit, which makes me feel good that I can sort of get you points by coming and listen to a talk like this. So what am I trying to accomplish? What are we going to be looking at in class today? 2014 was one of those years that was kind of just disoriented in a sense that protests really kind of had erupted all over the world for a variety of different reasons. So Ukraine sort of blew up in early part of 2014. Then you had the World Cup was emerging in the summer months, which I thought Brazil was really going to go crazy, but apparently Brazilians like like soccer more than like protesting, and so it kind of dwindled off once the soccer started. And then really what happened in September was really a resurgence of a lot of issues that I think this country thought it had dealt with back in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, and particularly Ferguson, Missouri, and the protests and unrest that emerged after that was kind of seen as the spark point of that resurgence in that type of protest there. And so that's kind of what I wanted to pick up and sort of break down and talk about today, in part because it sort of has emerged itself into our national consciousness for that. And one of the questions I get as an anthropologist quite a bit is what's going on in Ferguson? And another common question that we have is, can something like that happen here in the United States? And that really, there are the two questions that I find myself getting asked a lot in sort of a professional capacity relating to this. So I thought it would take time in this particular space to be able to sort of unpack that a lot more in a more of a formal sense. So I'd like to primarily sort of try to do three things, hopefully in the next hour or so, one of which is this providing you with a small sort of framework of anthropological theory. So those of you who are still my students in here, some of this will be familiar. For the majority of the audience that I don't recognize, really kind of got to get on the same page and sort of just give you an idea in terms of how I think about issues like this. So what we'll do is we'll sort of unlie that anthropological framework that we'll be using to think about protests and sort of different sort of community conflicts that might emerge for that, and then specifically start breaking down or deconstructing the episode of Ferguson and see really what were some of the causal factors that led to such widespread protest across the entire community. And then once we identify those factors, then we can kind of think forward in terms of our own place here in the Grand Rapids community to think about, is something like this possible in Grand Rapids? And if it is possible, what might we do to sort of mitigate some of those concerns in there? And so those are kind of the three things that hopefully I'll be able to accomplish over the next little bit of time. And so that was really kind of the biggest question that really jumped out. Was a lot of people are like, why Ferguson? How many of you have ever heard of Ferguson, Missouri before September of last year? Like one person probably drove through there to get gas one day. That was probably about it. So it's sort of odd, the place. And so that was my first initial reaction, is how random is this? Because on a lot of respects, when you start looking into sort of the characteristic of Ferguson, it has really stood out for precisely one thing and one thing only: how utterly unremarkable it was. Ferguson, on so many different measures, this seemed like just basically your average, ordinary suburb within a fairly metropolitan area within the United States. It was not distinguished very, very well from really any other parts of the United States. So why was that simply the place in which so much unrest and so much sort of strife across sort of the shooting of Michael Brown and how that emerged? Sadly, it's not like black men don't get shot every day. And black men don't get shot by the police officers every day, which disproportionately it actually kind of works out that way. So why this one? And why in this particular town in here? And so on the surface, part of the issue was Ferguson was so unremarkable and so average. But as we start looking at it more and more, what I'm realizing in that it's precisely its averageness that really sort of should give us pause to think about our own communities in there. And so one of the things that I'll probably hopefully be able to demonstrate is that it's much more probably of an emerging property within United States history regarding a number of different racial and class relationships that really are sort of creating a sense of conflict that really has the potential to erupt in other parts of the United States. And so therefore, rather than simply seeing this as an anomalous blip, we should really be looking at it as sort of something that represents an emerging phenomenon in the United States history that I think it's prudent that we step back and think about the lessons that we can get and how we apply those lessons here in this particular community. So that's sort of the importance of why we should pay attention in there. So how to think about this in anthropological theory. What we're dealing with is basically a stratified society. Most modern states have some degree of strata, even though sort of within our lore, we have the idea of the American dream that we're an upwardly mobile society. All of us recognize the existence of social classes. That's what I recognize or sort of mean when I say a stratified society. So within the anthropological literature or the social theory about this, we recognize stratification really is representing broad categories of people in any one society that have disproportionate access to those material rewards. And so Max Weber would talk about those material rewards as wealth, power, and prestige. And we can recognize that individuals really hold a different proportion of wealth, power, and prestige at different amounts. What's wealth, basically? Money. What's the easiest way to get wealth? Inherit it. Be born into it. It's by and far the easiest way. The joke I like to tell is having a conversation with somebody and they say, oh man, I'm worth $20 million. I'm like, how'd you make $20 million? He's like, I was born with $40 million. And so what we see then is that wealth, and one of the aspects of wealth in the United States society is that it tends to be concentrated between generations. In that sense that wealth, your ability to have access to wealth is disproportionately because of the social strata that you happen to be born into. Now, there's other elements of social rewards that, apart from wealth, and you can have no wealth and still have what we call prestige, which would be social recognition. And so the one I like to joke in class is, raise your hand if you know who Justin Bieber is. So I hear one person, she's smiling, so she's a big Justin Bieber fan. The rest of you are like, I'm not raising my hand in public because I'm going to be on television admitting that I know who Justin Bieber is. I never said like Justin Bieber, I just said know who Justin Bieber is. And that we recognize that there is sort of a cult of fame in the United States, that we recognize that individuals have a degree of social recognition or prestige that afford them a degree of renown. Apart from, I don't know what Bieber's bank account's like, but he's probably paid a few court fines over the years, that it might not be very, very big. So you could argue that Bieber does not have wealth, but he has some degree of prestige in there. And so people's access to prestige becomes disproportionate as well. For instance, if you win the lottery, you become wealthy, but you lack essentially the prestige that comes up along with that, as opposed to making most of your wealth as a doctor, where you not only get the wealth that comes along with it, but you also get to enjoy the prestige that comes with that particular profession in that regard. And so we recognize those as separate material rewards, although they tend to be very, very linked together. Could you stand up for a second? I need your chair. Thanks. All right, you can have a seat. I'm just kidding. That's power. The ability to exert your will over somebody else. Why'd you give me your chair? Because I asked. He's very, very nice like this. But we have a particular power dynamic in this setting right now. You're sitting, taking notes to a stranger. Excuse me, I shouldn't pat there. How many of you know who I am? Few people. More than that. The rest of you are still taking notes from a random stranger. Why are you listening to me? Why? Because I'm standing up and I got the clicker. And it seems like I'm occupying a position of importance because the guy's got a camera trained on me. So if I walk by you, you're going to be on camera. Why? Because I'm marking my position of power by how I'm dressing and the physical layout of this particular space. I'm standing, you're sitting. I'm talking, you're writing. That we recognize in any one interpersonal relationship that there is a power dynamic that you can exert that over different individuals. And so if I'm the speaker asking somebody to give me a chair, he's not going to think too hard about it because he's reading this particular relationship, as opposed to if another student came in late and realized that, oh my, there's no seats left, and walked up to him and say, can I have your chair? He'd be like, no. Because there's a different power dynamic that's in there, the ability to compel people to do something in there. And so the joke I like to do with my students to make them aware of power in their lives is, raise your hand if you know who Bert Blecky is. All right, the majority of you do not. Bert Blecky is the chairman of the Board of Trustees here at Grand Rapids Community College. All right, for you GRCC students, raise your hand if you've paid tuition. All right, everybody have your hands. We have this on camera, so we can check this later. The Board of Trustees, among other things they do, essentially sets the tuition rate per credit hour for students at GRCC. Most of you have paid that tuition and never even thought twice about it. That you just simply do it. Why? Because that's what I do. Why did you pay that particular amount? Did you go down to the registrar's office and say, you know what, it's like 100-something a credit hour. I'll give you 50. Try to negotiate with them. It'd be fun, but you're not going to get anywhere because they're going to say, well, the credit hour is 106. You can go elsewhere. And what you're recognizing then that there's a power relationship, that there's control. You're here for a reason, which is to get a degree, but you just can't get a degree from anywhere or print one out. That there's got to be a sanctioning that comes along with your granting of that particular degree. And that's a power relationship that all of you are intuitively aware of, which is why you generally pay tuition and not think too hard about it. And so you could argue then that Bert Blecky, I don't know what his bank account's like, but he's probably not all that wealthy. He clearly has no prestige because very few of you actually know who he is as an individual. But he has power in this context in the sense that he can literally compel you to pay money and you don't really think too hard about it. And so those are really the different aspects of social stratification. And when we talk about stratification, what we're talking about is your access to those material rewards. The New York Times the other day had a study of your probability of becoming a senator in the United States is astronomically low. That would be power. The access to essentially one of the highest legislative body in the United States. That's power. Your access to the Senate is astronomically low. Less than one of you will become a senator in this room, I guarantee it. I'm going to hedge my bet. One of you might, but on average, none of you are going to be. Not that you shouldn't aim high, you should. But if you're born to a senator, that sons of senators have a 1 in 9 chance of becoming a senator in the United States. That you have a 1 in probably 10 million chance of becoming a senator if you're not a child of a senator. However, if you're born to an individual where you have access to your parents' wealth, power, and prestige, or their political network, you have actually a very, very good chance of being able to move into that particular position in life. That's what we mean by social stratification, that your position in life is really oftentimes afforded to you by your position at birth. And we recognize here, obviously in the States, that we have 3 classes. We have an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class. Everybody's sort of comfortable with that. But the United States is different. Because when we look anthropologically at a variety of different stratified societies, that they tend to organize those social strata quite a bit differently. Another common example that gets used is the caste system in India. And in the caste system in India, your caste or your social strata is much more rigidly afforded to you at birth. And it's generally related to lineage, which patrilineage you're born into, and those are generally tied into your particular occupational history. And the further and further away you get away from dealing with bodily of things such as tanning and that, the more sacredly pure you get within Indian society, and therefore more upper class you have in that cultural context. And what happens then is, depending upon which caste you're born into, you have a disproportionate access to wealth, power, and prestige. Other societies, which would be, so if you look in more of a capitalist European context, that you have those emerging upper, middle, and lower classes that generally are reflecting in terms of economic strata. But in the United States, because of our unique history of interactions between different groups of individuals, we really can see the social construction of race as one important component to social stratification within United States history, in part resulting back to our history in terms of being a slave country. Bringing individuals over in bondage obviously brings them in at an extraordinarily low social strata. Even after emancipation, what we see then is that individuals of quote-unquote African ancestry in the United States would essentially still be in a very, very low class position, in part because every single stratified society out there has different social markers of positioning. In a lot of cases, those social markers of positioning are stuff like dress. That if you can dress in a certain way, you can project your class position differently. Others have language. If you speak Hindi in India, you're conceived of as being at a much more of the lower class caste individuals. Whereas if you have access to the colonial language in India, or colonial language of English in India, you're referencing or verbally marking your position in the upper social strata in there. And so language becomes a very, very distinctive marker of that. Well, here in the United States, we have a very, very visible marker in the sense of skin color, which is one of the major components of our social construction of race. What we do is we visually construct individuals of being in a lower class position, not because of anything they've done as individuals, but that's basically the nature of our social strata. And so in terms of the title of my talk, I have race and class projected together because from my analytical positioning using this particular bit of theory is you really can't separate those two issues. That our social construction of race, our history of race in the United States is very much a history of class relations and a history of struggle and conflict between classes. Now, that doesn't say that individuals of European ancestry don't fit themselves into a lower class place, but we also see ethnicity playing at that regard. That a lot of them tended to be non-Anglo-Saxon Protestant immigrants to the United States. So if anybody's of Irish ancestry, the saying from U.S. historians is the Irish really didn't become white in the United States, or the Italians didn't become white in the United States until really the early 1940s in there. And because there's a complex relationship of our notions of ethnicity and race in U.S. history, that those notions are really a facet of our landscape of social stratification, that disproportionate access to those material rewards in society. And so that kind of gives us one basis for thinking about the relationship between different communities in Ferguson, Missouri. The other body of theory that we have to think about then is if we have social strata, where we have individuals that are occupying positions of authority and power, superordinates, and individuals that occupy lower class positions, subordinates, that there's got to be some way to maintain those class relationships, that there has to be some mechanism in a society to maintain social stratification. Otherwise, if it's completely openly mobile, you wouldn't see economic data that shows persistence of class divisions, which we see here in the United States. And so how do you maintain control over subordinates within a particular community? Well, the anthropological literature really distinguishes between two forms of control that really are opposite sides of this coin. One would be coercion, and the other would be a term coined by Anthony Gramsci, which is an Italian theorist who spent some time in prison because he was trying to challenge superordinates, the Mussolini fascist regime, gets himself thrown in prison. Then he spends the rest of his time in prison trying to figure out why he was in prison. And so while he was there, he came up with this idea of hegemony. And that really a lot of social theorists have drawn from Gramsci's idea of hegemony, which is domination of subordinate classes through ideas rather than physical coercion. And so I have a picture of the Panopticon here, which for any of you who have read Foucault, really Foucault talks about in terms of landscapes of power, is it's far more easy and much more effective to dominate a group of individuals through their minds or their ideology rather than it is through physical coercion. And the Panopticon becomes a common example of that, which is a prison that came about in the 1800s. And the idea here was that you have all the prisoner cells on the ring of this circular area, and they're backlit with light. And then what you have then is a central guard tower that is darkened, which means that the prisoners there are constantly being surveilled or monitored from a central location. That no matter what they do, their bodies are being blacklit, so there's really no way that they can do any sort of illegal activities in their prison cells. What they don't know is whether somebody's even occupying that central tower or not. In other words, the idea or the role of the Panopticon is to surveil prisoners through dominating their minds. And Foucault talks about that that's a far more effective means to maintain control over a population is by controlling the symbolism and the narratives and the ideologies that a society really uses as its broad narrative of sense. Dominating through these ideologies is a far more effective means because what you're doing is you're ruling through consent. That people are willfully ceding authority, willfully ceding power to somebody else, even if it is not in their best interest to cede that particular form of power. And you see this in a lot of different contexts where control over the symbols becomes really the primary locus of struggles between superordinate and subordinate categories. Once you can dominate through somebody's idea, once you've ceded the idea that somebody has control over a person, you rarely question that idea, which is what ends up happening. How many of you paid your tuition because GRCC police officers came to your door and said, give me $100? That would be coercive power. So if I asked you who paid your tuition and one of you, or anybody not pay their tuition to show up for class, that'd be awesome. Because if you did, I'm supposed to go find that phone that's in here and hit the code 2 button and have you physically removed from my class. What you'd be doing is you're contesting the ordering of society, the idea that you have to pay tuition to come to class. If you contest that, you're not giving consent to having authority over your person or your behavior or activity. And then what ends up happening then is that the coercive apparatus of power, which would be authorities, comes in and that maintains the semblance of authority and power through the use of force or more likely the threat of force. And that ultimately is what's underneath the sequence in there. It's a far more effective means just to convince you that you should pay tuition. Why do you pay tuition? Well, that's just simply how it is. That the only way I can learn is by going to class. And the only way I can go to class is by paying credit hour tuition. Even though you can literally learn everything I'm talking about by going to the library and not coming to class. So what are you sitting here listening to me for? I'm not saying anything new. All I'm doing is just repeating ideas that other people have talked about that are in print in the library. Why? Because you've subjected yourself to the ideology that this is how learning happens. It's an idea that orders our social relationships, and you've consented to that. Why? Because in an immediate sense, it's to your advantage to consent to that. Because you don't want to just learn something. What you really want is to be able to prove to an employer that you've learned something. And how do you prove to an employer that you've learned something? You submit your transcripts. And so really, you're not paying to listen to me and learn from me. You're paying so that we can provide you with a transcript of what you've learned from me and you listened from me in there in that sense. That's how hegemony operates. Once you've idealized that that's the correct order of how society happens to be, what you tend to do is you tend to conform your behavior to those norms or those rules of power without ever questioning it. You've consented to be dominated in Gramsci's sense of the term. When that breaks down, a society really needs to operate on their coercive power or coercion. And what ends up happening then is when it resorts to coercion, what happens then is that it really tends to sort of become very, very unstable. If you're looking at sort of a lot of the instability that is occurring in different parts of the Middle East, where you're having active revolts and active contentions of power, what you're having then is the hegemony of various rulers breaking down. So the revolution that happened in the Arab Spring in Egypt a few years ago was individuals that were contesting the idea that Mubarak should be the ruler of Egypt. Everybody's like, why is he in charge? Well, he's always been in charge. Well, how did he get in charge? Don't know. But it seemed natural. It seemed like the order of things, and because they never questioned it, they've internalized it, and they succumbed to consent to his authority. Once they challenged that, though, Mubarak had to rely upon his coercive apparatus, which was the Egyptian military, to come into Trafalgar Square in order to remove the protesters. And what ended up happening was active resistance to that as a means of challenging not just the coercive power, but also putting forth an alternative narrative, a counter-hegemony in terms of offering a different order of how things are. Now, individuals of lower social strata don't necessarily passively absorb hegemony all the time. In fact, what we recognize is that in any one society, that there's active resistances that are going on to that dominative narrative, the dominant idea that this is how society should be ordered. And really, a lot of times what it is a competition for controlling symbols and a competition for controlling the ideas and the narratives. Imagine you're rich, or if you are rich, why are you rich and other people poor? Who's worked harder? They would only work as hard as I do. It becomes a morality play that justifies the ordering of social strata. In contrast, if you're down here on the other end of the social strata and you're looking at those people up there, what's the narrative becoming? Bunch of greedy, stingy people. That what you're having then is really two alternative versions of reality that are in competition to one another. When you're in positions of power, though, you get to dominate the public transcript or the public narrative of what those relationships happen to be. If you're not in a position of power, you do not have access to controlling that public transcript, but that doesn't mean that you do not maintain your own alternative version, which is what James Scott calls the hidden transcripts that are prevalent within societies or among groups of lower social strata in society. I was playing a few songs before class began. Anybody recognize them? Or not class, but speech. Where are they from? Yeah, they're slave spirituals. And so what we see then emerging within the era of slavery in United States history are spirituals that are drawing upon images from Scripture and reimagining them in terms of articulating alternative social relationships between slaves and slave owners. They were resistances that were being put forth in the context of song, and they were sung readily within slave communities as a means of providing a hidden transcript. They were creating an ideology of counter-hegemony. In addition, they were encoding information about where to go after running away. So they're built into the Underground Railroad. They're also giving ideas in terms of how to escape away. So steal away, as I was playing, is an indication then that you're planning on stealing away. And so the song specifically is stealing away to Jesus, but underneath the surface of that is that you're planning on running away, and everybody knows how to provide you with extra resources that can facilitate you in there. There's a hidden transcript that's going on. And so even though you have a group of individuals that are as utterly dominated, both in a hegemonic sense and a coercive sense, as anybody in a United States history, which were slaves during the slave era, still maintain a very, very active and vibrant body of resistance through hidden transcripts, which are those counter-narratives. You see those at play even in today's society. If you talk to somebody that comes from a very, very affluent class, they're talking about things in one way. If you talk to individuals down here, they're talking about things in a completely different way. That doesn't mean that one's making it up and the other is not. What they're doing is they're offering alternative versions of the same body of reality. The truth usually is somewhere in the middle. But what you're having is contestation over what those ideas actually are. Or sometimes that you can involve small acts of resistance, little boycotts, foot dragging, not working as sort of hard, not picking as much cotton if you're in a slave context. Some of James Scott's research was among Malay peasant rice farmers. And what they'd talk about is the way in which they would negotiate payment and show up late. In order to sort of pressure landowners that they weren't going to get the rice harvest in time. And so it was a small act of resistance. Or when combine farmers showed up, or combine harvesters showed up, they would use acts of sabotage to break them down as a means to building up or preserving their own position, which was a very, very weak position. They had really no control over power in that community, but it was an act of resistance in the sense that James Scott calls them weapons of the weak. Or not knocking all the rice off the stalk. So if you want to get all the rice off of that, you would hit the stalk 5-6 times to fill up your gunny sack, which would be your wages, which was paid by the sack of rice that you have. But what they would do then is they'd only hit it 2 or 3 times, particularly in the absence of the landowner monitoring people's activities. And what would happen then is that their family members would be able to come back later on and glean off of the rice, and so be able to pick additional rice that hadn't fallen off during the harvesting period. Those are small acts of resistance that was designed around contesting those class relationships, those relationships of social strata. And so what we see then is within this body, we have those 2 different relationships, that you have both public transcripts and you have hidden transcripts that are alternative versions. People are in competition over that hegemonic ideas. In addition, that when available, obviously if you're in a low social strata, that you have immediate pragmatic concerns, which is finding food, shelter, and clothing, that really prohibits doing much more coercive or much more overt acts of resistance. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to toe the line. How far can you go by exerting some degree of class consciousness, yet still not cross the line too much where you're getting sanctioned and losing your ability for there. And so what we see then is that in a stratified society, you have alternative competing interests. You have different strategies that people in elite positions use to maintain positions of power, and you have a variety of different strategies that other individuals use in positions of subordinates or lack of power in order to maintain and struggle over those particular relationships. That's the landscape in which Ferguson, Missouri erupted out of, basically. What happened immediately was a struggle over a narrative. That's that hidden transcript and public transcript erupting into a struggle. Because immediately what happened is you got 2 conflicting accounts of what went on Canfield Drive. The first public account was that a struggle ensued between Michael Brown and the police officer, and in a result of fearing for his life in that struggle, the police officer shot Michael Brown and he fled, and then as the police officer pursued that, Michael Brown then charged the police officer and he fired in self-defense. The alternative narrative emerged was that Michael Brown had his hands up and he was surrendering in there. Now, what's emerged then, obviously through the legal process, is that the particular police officer's narrative has been upheld. But that really didn't matter in the sense of unfolding the protest, because what you had was the public transcript that was the official one not being accepted by those that would, quote unquote, be in the subordinate position within Ferguson society. Rather, what happened then is that the hidden transcript, the narrative that individuals of that social strata were talking amongst themselves, became the public transcript. It became an overt narrative that was in direct opposition to the official narrative of power. And that's ultimately what the dispute emerged over, was whose version of the narrative was ultimately correct. But that just doesn't happen overnight. Really, rarely do you find peasant revolutions or revolts. And when they do happen, they tend not to work very often. And so why do people go through outright protest, particularly when oftentimes those protests get crushed very, very quickly? Well, they don't happen overnight. And really, it's not until positions where a group of individuals in a lower social strata have nothing to lose that those hidden transcripts erupt into the public. And that ultimately is what emerged in the context of Ferguson, is that what happened in September was actually a long time in coming. And really, it reached to a point in which individuals who have maintained a distinctive hidden transcript as a coordinated act of resistance to power have got to the point where that emerged itself into public. In other words, the hegemonic power held by authorities in Ferguson was contested. Because if the hegemonic power, the idea that police officers have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, then if the police officer shoots an individual, that force is legitimate. The power, or the exercise of coercive power, is legitimate. And if it's legitimate, then you don't challenge it. But if you break down the idea that power is legitimate, that you remove your consent because you're now challenging the dominant elite narrative, that's when individuals start viewing that as an illegitimate use of coercive power rather than a legitimate use of force. And that really ultimately is what occurred. And so what happened is that over time, the level of consent had been eroded for various historical reasons. And once that level of consent becomes eroded, then what you end up having is the emergence of a recalibration, that individuals who have been maintaining a sense of class consciousness, a sense of an integrated community that has been trying to resist essentially that stratified power struggle, have found themselves more or less on a losing side of that particular struggle, to the point that they were pushed to the point that they have no other recourse but to try to recalibrate those class relationships by taking hidden transcripts and moving them and emerging them into the public realm, which is why Ferguson blew up the way it did. Not because of one particular act of violence, but it blew up because of all these other acts of resistance and coercion, and resistance of coercion that have been built up through the lived experience of the residents of Ferguson, Missouri. And that becomes a landscape then to think about specifically what happened that resulted in that, and then what lessons can we draw from that in terms of our particular experiences here in the Grand Rapids area. I'm going to give you 3 historical processes. These are all integrated together. And this is what I think is an emerging phenomenon in U.S. history that really causes us to need to pause and really think about what's going on. The first involves demographic changes that have occurred and the physical movement of communities in United States history. The problem is that those physical movements of populations has really resulted in isolation from one another. That the demographic changes that have occurred in various communities throughout the United States has really resulted in the formation and maintenance of very, very rigid social boundaries. And that becomes problematic. And then what we'll look at is an implication of that is particularly in communities where individuals have gotten locked out of positions of influence and authority, that they start contesting local authorities' hegemonic control, or the consent of power. And once that consent of power gets challenged, then you create the conditions in which protests can emerge out of that. And then specifically, the immediate lived experiences that cause that difficulty. So what demographic shifts or historic population movements am I talking about? Well, what we recognize is that where you live is primarily determined by how much money you have. And if your social strata is determined by how much money you have, then that determines where essentially you live. That has always been the case in United States history. But if one of the reasons why class and race have been you can't tease the two out. That's that word. Thank you, Gordon. This is very, very good. Somebody taught him good English. If you can't tease them apart, then what happens is if you sort out where you live by social class. And social class is determined in part by a history of race and ethnicity in the United States, then what we end up with is essentially geographic isolation or geographic segregation of communities on that basis. A number of different ways: housing prices themselves, access to get mortgages, less so today, but outright redlining, which was the manipulation of communities in order to ensure a particular ethnic composition in those communities. And again, those largely play out along ethnic lines in the United States. What we saw, particularly during the early part of the 1900s, was what's known as the Great Migration, where you had a lot of African Americans migrating from the South and the former plantation areas of the South into the northern cities in search of jobs. They'd primarily moved into and lived into the urban core of major cities in the northern half of the United States. In response to that, you had what's called white flight, where you had the emergence and the development of suburbs as a unique feature of the American landscape. And so what happens is you have African Americans moving up from down south into the urban core, displacing white populations in urban core to the suburbs. And then that really created the geographic segregation, where the inner urban city area is predominantly a non-white population ringed around by a suburban white population. Beginning in probably the 1990s, probably a little bit earlier if somebody really wants to work through some of these numbers, is what you had then are individuals moving out of the inner city to the inner ring suburbs, the suburbs closest to the urban areas, for the exact same reasons that you saw white flight a few generations earlier. So you see African American communities moving into the inner ring suburbs in search of good schools, some degree of safety, the same exact reasons anybody else moves into. And so they move into those inner ring suburbs, places like Ferguson, Missouri. And what ends up happening then is the white population in the inner ring suburbs move to the outer ring suburbs, and you continually end up with this displacement. And so property values fluctuate, but what we saw then are various movements of entire communities. But despite the fact you had such large demographic movement of individuals, what you ended up still with is more or less geographic isolation between individuals. You can see that in terms of census mapping here. So here's a map of St. Louis, Missouri. You got Ferguson right here. The downtown area of St. Louis is here. And what you see then is largely a non-white urban core within the northern suburbs, the inner ring suburbs of St. Louis, movement of non-white individuals into these communities, and ringing around that, the further away, are your high concentrations of people of European ancestry. We have the same thing here in Grand Rapids. This is very, very common among pretty much every northern city. And what we have here is, in southeast Grand Rapids, a large non-white population, and then ringing around this is within your outer ring suburbs is a large concentration of white population. Or if you want to look specifically at the African American community in St. Louis, again, you have the city of St. Louis and East St. Louis, and then the inner ring suburbs to the north and northern part of St. Louis County that have high proportions of African American residences, and then further and further away out this direction, you have communities that are still being maintained as predominantly, and if, in some respects, exclusively white communities. Again, this is a very, very common pattern that we see here in Grand Rapids. Southeast Grand Rapids has historically been the African American community in the city of Grand Rapids, and then you get movement of individuals out of that context into the nearest suburb, which would be to the southeast, which is Kentwood. So Kentwood and Wyoming represent our inner ring suburbs here in the city of Grand Rapids. And so what you're having then is demographic shift into the city of Kentwood. Former white residents in the city of Kentwood are now moving out elsewhere. Our landscape of ethnicity and race in the city of Grand Rapids is a little different because we also have a sizable Hispanic or Latino population as well. So Southwest Grand Rapids is where the Latino enclave is in the Southwest, established a significant inner city population here, and then that's drifting into the nearest inner ring suburb to the southwest, which is the city of Wyoming. So we see this exact same demographic shifts in terms of population movements. You have individuals moving into the cheaper housing in inner core areas, displacing white residents to the suburbs. As people chase good schools and good jobs into the suburbs, you continue to displace then white residents that either flee further and further afield or return back to gentrified neighborhoods in the inner cities, such as Heritage Hill. Regardless of how you shape it out, what you end up have are distinctive communities organized on the basis of race and race is generally class in the United States, and those communities tend to be not just geographically isolated from one another, but what you end up forming then and establishing are distinct social boundaries that keep one group of people away from interacting with other groups of people. And once you create those social boundaries, then you create the context of class consciousness. This is us, that's them. No matter which side of that boundary you happen to be on, you're us, and they become them. Why? Because of that geographic isolation in there. So geography has one thing to do with it. So in terms of drawing lessons from Ferguson, Missouri, what we see then is one of the underlying factor causes very much is still at play within the Grand Rapids community. But again, this is showing up in all sorts of different places within the United States. Not just geographic isolation, but where you live dictates where you go to school. So this is a snapshot of 2 different elementary schools that are literally just down the street from each other in Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson is almost 80% black residents and about 20% white residents. But if you go to Blessed Teresa, which is the only private school within the city of Ferguson, it's 63% white and only 26% black students. In contrast, the nearest public school is almost 93% black students and extraordinarily low amount of white students. So not only are individuals not living near each other, they're not going to school with each other as well, which is another way in which social boundaries form and tend to persist in that regard. We see the same thing in the Grand Rapids area. These are the private schools here, which are predominantly white students. These are the Southeast Grand Rapids public schools, which are predominantly black. These are the Southwest Grand Rapids public schools, which are predominantly Latino. And so what we end up with then is the formation of distinct communities organized around the basis of a consciousness that in the United States history is organized around the notions of race, which is a socially constructed consciousness. We're us, they are them. And once you create that class consciousness, what you're doing is you're preventing the interaction or the movement across those social boundaries because you don't live near people and you certainly don't get to know them through school. That's the demographic changes, not just occurring in Ferguson, not just occurring in Grand Rapids, but it really is a phenomenon that you can see pretty much in every urban area within the northern part of the United States. In other words, it's the groundwork of an emerging phenomenon of social relationships that really are going to characterize the United States going forward from here. The second one then is how power structures in these communities operate. And this ties into the first one, because what you're seeing then is slow demographic change. White people move to the suburbs, black people follow. White people go further afield, and then you have a composition of the suburbs that now becomes a demographic flip. But what happens is we notice that there's a substantial lag in the power structures in that context. And that's one of the issues with Ferguson, is what you have is generally an all-white upper management that is presiding over a largely African-American community. Now, that into itself isn't necessarily problematic. A lot of people will point forth, well, people should just vote, right? And so one of the sort of most distinctive things is, well, if demography is in your side, then you should be able to elect whoever you want in there. But what we recognize is that demography has less to do with elections than the establishment of civic institutions. What's more important is the existence of strong community-based civic institutions that is able then to identify, to mobilize, and to support individual candidates. In the absence of those institutions, which take time to form, demography has no effect then in terms of who you want to vote for, because if you don't want to vote for anybody, how many of you are going to show up at the polls? No, you're going to stay home. You have to be motivated. You have to have some sort of connection in order to encourage you to go to the particular polls. And so what we tend to find then is that the existence of civic institutions are probably the most critical factor then in driving elections and power structures in these particular contexts. The problem is that those take time to develop. So if we look at the city council for Ferguson, Missouri, what we end up with is a town that demographically speaking has a very, very small percentage of white population. In contrast, the city council itself is more or less dominated by white residents. The most distinctive feature of this, though, is not Commissioner James. It's the ward that Commissioner James is a commissioner in. Because Ward 3, and Commissioner Conway is of European ancestry here, Ward 3 is almost 95% black residences. In fact, it's the most densest concentration of black residents in the entire city of Ferguson. So despite the fact that Ward 3 has the highest concentration of black residents, that ward has never elected an African-American council member. Mr. Johnson, or Commissioner James, I'm sorry, was actually recruited from more or less the white community in order to be a candidate in Ward 2. And so that really illustrates the role or the importance of civic institutions in maintaining that. We can see the opposite of this within the city of Grand Rapids, because the black community in the city of Grand Rapids has been established for a great deal longer time, and what they've managed to form are very, very strong civic institutions with tight ties into the city council. In other words, not only do they have an active voice in the ability to recruit viable candidates, but the community itself also feels like it has that voice because it has commissioners then that they have strong ties with on a local sense. That's lacking in Ferguson. So when we look at the city of Grand Rapids, which is still nominally a majority white city at 64%, if you look at Ward 3, which is predominantly where the African American community is, both of the commissioners here are from that particular community, in part because they were recruited and supported by these established civic institutions that are in that part of the city of Grand Rapids. My apology to Mayor Hartwell for cropping his head off, but I thought it was more important to get Commissioners Lumpkin and Leonard in there. I guess he's been term limited, I guess, so it's a bad joke for political science. Never mind. The illustration here is that civic institutions themselves are the biggest determinant of the ability to get individuals elected, because those are necessary to identify, to prep, and to support candidates. In the absence of those, that's when you end up with a lack of voice in city councils. And you can see the same thing in Ferguson. Ferguson lacks all of those institutions. They have no local chapters of the NAACP, no individual community-based organizations to advocate for specific communities in there. Because you have a recent origin of people moving into suburbs, you haven't established well-established historically black churches in the area, so you lack any sorts of civic institutions that allow individuals to have an integrated voice together, and that causes a distinct difference in terms of your ability to get individuals elected. So Grand Rapids is actually doing pretty good as a city. Why? Because of the historically deep nature of those particular communities. The one lacking voice in there would largely be the more recent Latino population that has recently moved into the city of Grand Rapids on the southwest side. They actually lack a commissioner from their particular community, in part because they're now establishing some very, very strong Latino civic organizations in Grand Rapids, but it takes a few election cycles in order to get those candidates up onto that ballot in there. And so what you see then is that a historically recent demographic movement causes an absence of voice into the power structures that they lag behind. So Wyoming itself, which has about 20% Hispanic population or Latino population there, lacks any voice on their particular city council. Not that anybody in here is actively or nefariously going to be subjugating its Latino population. These are all very, very good-natured, civic-minded individuals. The problem is that they probably don't have any idea of the experiences of people that are living in the Latino community in the city of Wyoming. And that's really where the difference is. And once you have that lack of connection, that there's a social boundary there that is fixated by demography, you create the conditions for mistrust. Not that individuals are necessarily acting differently, but that there is that mistrust that is put forth there. And so we see, again, the same phenomenons that are occurring in Ferguson, which is a lack of those deep-seated civic institutions are at play within the city of Wyoming. And the same thing with the city of Kentwood. Kentwood's opposite. Rather than having a sizable Latino population, they have predominantly a large black community at about 35%. Despite the fact that having a sizable black community, they lack any voice or representation on the city council, in part because of the lack of those deep-seated civic institutions that allow them to put forth and support specific candidates in local communities. So we're working through this particular cycle here. You get demographic shifts. One of the implications of demographic shifts then are isolating communities on the basis of race and ethnicity. But because demographic shifts into inner suburbs are historically recent, what they also do is they lack the civic institutions necessary to provide them with voice in terms of municipal council. So they lack any access to the structures of power within those communities, despite the fact of being, in some respects, the majority residents, or in other respects, a substantial minority residents in communities. They still lack that access to power because those demographic changes take time to turn over. Again, this is a phenomenon that is probably occurring not just in Ferguson, but is also occurring in our inner ring suburbs in Wyoming and Kentwood, but is also likely occurring in the majority of inner ring suburbs all across the northern cities of the United States, where you're having this type of turnover with a lagging behind of power structure turnover in that regard. And then finally, if you add in another element, which is the reliance upon fines and forfeitures as a means of funding strained city budgets because of declining property values and tax receipts, what ends up happening then is that as police action is producing a revenue stream into the city budgets, and individuals themselves now feel like they lack a voice on the city councils, and if in their hidden transcripts they start perceiving that they're unfairly being targeted, what they start doing is they start withdrawing their consent. They stop accepting hegemonic power, and they start resisting much more effectively against hegemonic power, in part because they lack that voice and they feel unnecessarily oppressed or alienated in that regard. And so what we end up with then is that this relationship where active policing, which is producing a large revenue stream in a community that has turned over, is really resulting in a disproportionate burden of those fines and forfeitures falling on the non-white residents within a city, despite the fact that they lack the voice in terms of power structures. And that ultimately became the proximate cause that really led to the civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri. Obviously, Michael Brown's shooting was the event that triggered it, but the very, very proximate cause was an increased reliance upon fines and forfeitures and very, very aggressive policing by the Ferguson Police Department. And that's what really led to the withdrawal of consent. And once they withdrew consent, what ends up happening is they start questioning the legitimacy of power. And once you contest the legitimacy of power, then what ends up happening is you either have to overtly resist, which is protests, or find some other way to struggle against that. And that's ultimately happened here. I'm going to let the Justice Department sit and say, beat me to it. But what they ended up doing was they started looking into the relationship between the city police in Ferguson and the city council. And what they found was that as fines and forfeitures went up, it wasn't just simply a random or a passive relationship with the amount of crime, but it was actually an active-driven agency response on the part of the city manager in order to use fines and forfeitures as a significant revenue stream within a strained general budget. You see that here in the exchange that the city finance director had with the chief of police in Ferguson, which was essentially saying, write some more speeding tickets. What ends up happening then is people start using residents as more or less an ATM. Our sales tax are declining, and so we have to make up this revenue somehow. And how you make up the revenue is by relying more and more on fines and forfeitures rather than community-based policing as your means of generating budgets in there. So if you have stress now, and that stressor is people getting tickets and struggling against these particular authoritative structures, and you have mistrust because they feel they have no voice in terms of city councils, then you create really the underlying causal factors that lead to outright protests. And so what we ended up seeing was a very, very set of clear patterns of First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment violations. Individuals are unconstituted and being stopped. If you simply were on the street, a police officer would come up to you and say, show me your ID, which technically is a violation of your right to assemble peacefully. What they tend to do is tend to run for warrants. And then if you question that, one of the most common tickets that were awarded within the Ferguson Police Department was a disobedience. So you disobeyed a law enforcement. So if they ask you for something unconstitutionally and you resist that unconstitutional demand, you all of a sudden now have a ticket for it that you now have to go through the court system to do. There's a clear racial profiling or bias within those particular stops. And then they're unconsciously using different sorts of searches and seizures for that. One of the things for political science students is that you need to have probable cause to detain somebody. And so what Ferguson was actually using was a wanted, which is kind of the APBs, in order to detain residents that they verbally admitted that they didn't have enough probable cause to detain. So if part of the reason is to use this to ensure that people have probable cause, but you're actually using it as a means to detain somebody because you lack probable cause, generally what that is an unconstitutional sort of act. A lot of those unconstitutional stops then disproportionately fell on the black community within Ferguson, Missouri. And so the search rate was twice of what the search rate would be for a white motorist that would, say, be pulled over, despite the fact that when pulled over and searched, a white motorist was far more likely to actually have contraband on them. And so, unfortunately, despite the fact that if you pulled a white motorist over that they would have likely more contraband, the opposite turned to be over the fact that somebody would be detained even though they were less likely to have it. So that becomes some of the statistics that show some of that racial bias that comes forward into there. So what about the region of Grand Rapids in terms of reliance on fines and forfeitures? If we look at the city budgets, the city of Wyoming has a budget of about $20 million. $2 million of that has coming from fines and forfeitures that are a result of police actions. In contrast, the city of Kentwood, which is slightly smaller, has a smaller operating budget of about $14 million and a little over $1.3 million in terms of fines and forfeitures that are revenue generated each year. Now, most of you are looking at that and saying, I'm seeing a bunch of disassociated numbers that have no context to it. That's fair. So if we look at the city of Grand Rapids, you now have context. City of Grand Rapids, despite the fact that it has over twice as many residences as the city of Wyoming, writes about the same amount of fines and forfeitures as the city of Wyoming does. So either there's so much crime in Wyoming that you should never ever go there, or there's a disproportionate reliance upon fines and forfeitures within the city of Wyoming in order to generate particular revenue here. So despite the fact that city of Grand Rapids has a much higher annual operating budget, about 108 or 1.8 billion, so many commas there. So 1 billion. They have about the same amount of fines and forfeitures as the city of Wyoming happens to do. And we can put this into context. And what we're seeing then is in the inner cores, in the larger metropolitan areas like Grand Rapids and St. Louis, the reliance upon fines and forfeitures as a significant revenue stream is not as important, in part because of the very, very strong business base that fits within the city itself, which generates a number of external revenue. Once you move into the suburbs, though, in the municipalities, particularly the inner ring suburbs, you now have a situation where city budgets or municipal budgets are under stress. And what's happening then is in those types of communities, that's where you're seeing a disproportionate reliance upon fines and forfeitures to fund that. So if you look at 2% of Grand Rapids' operating budget is fines and forfeitures, and 10% of Wyoming's is, and then Ferguson actually wins a prize in the city of in Missouri. I think actually the Missouri court fined them because they actually have a state constitutional limit that you can't have more than 20% of your revenue coming from fines and forfeitures, which they obviously realized was a problem that's going on, not just in Ferguson, but some of the neighboring suburbs. So what you end up now is you're having a community that lacks a voice in upper management, that feels distrust for that is now disproportionately being leaned on as a revenue generating stream rather than a member of the community itself. And that's really causing that underlying proximal cause that ultimately leads to people to sort of move into the street and protest. So we looked at the revenue stream. So the question then becomes, how much of that is intentional on the part of suburban communities here in Grand Rapids? That becomes a much more difficult question. So if you live in Wyoming, that'd be a great question to go to a city council and ask. Or if you're a reporter, that'd be a really good question to spend an afternoon down in the district court. I don't have that time, so what I did is I downloaded ordinance and statute data. So what we're doing is we're looking at what is being filed by police officers when they write a ticket for somebody. They have a number of decisions that they can make. They can give you an ordinance violation, that would be a misdemeanor or a civil infraction. They can give you a statute violation, that would be a misdemeanor or a civil infraction, among other things. And what you see then is that you see different communities in the Grand Rapids region using different ways to sort of offer tickets here. District 63 is primarily the eastern suburbs, so Ada, Lowell, Cannon Township, the non-incorporated municipal areas. And what we see over here is really a heavy reliance upon statutes being administered, in part civil infraction traffic statute things. These are your speeding tickets. Don't speed in those suburbs. You'll get pulled over and they'll give you a big ticket. Occasionally they'll give a smaller percentage of misdemeanor traffic ones and then misdemeanor statutes in here, but for the most part it's traffic and then to a lesser extent parking tickets in there. When you look at the city of Grand Rapids, you're seeing a mix, particularly in Grand Rapids, Wyoming, and Kentwood. What you end up with is a much higher reliance upon the ordinance violations rather than the statute violations. But one of the peculiarities then, which I think is one of the issues in terms of how Wyoming is able to generate so much revenue compared to Kentwood and compared to Grand Rapids, despite the fact that they offer lower volumes of tickets, substantially lower volumes of tickets, they're still generating roughly the same amount of revenue as the city of Grand Rapids is through its district court. And one of the reasons for that is the disproportion relying on misdemeanor violations as opposed to civil infraction violations. A misdemeanor, if you've never gotten one, would be a much more serious offense that runs up to 93 days in jail. Not that I have the experience on that, I looked it up. But it also carries with you a larger fine. So if you get pulled over for something, a police officer has several options. One of those options is to write you a statute violation as opposed to an ordinance violation. The second option would be to give you a misdemeanor as opposed to a civil infraction. A civil infraction is something that you just simply walk down to the court, you pay your fine like a speeding ticket. The 31% here, in fact, the city of Wyoming has offered more misdemeanor traffic violations almost at the same rate that the city of Grand Rapids actually has, despite, again, lower volume. The same thing with misdemeanor ordinances in there, which I think is what you're seeing in terms of the disparity in there. In addition, when you look at the difference between these regions, is that the suburbs, much like Ferguson, is that they're using a heavy reliance upon ordinance statutes in order to generate a larger volume of revenue as opposed to the statutes here. The city of Grand Rapids has a pretty nice balance at 80-20. The much more unincorporated areas that oftentimes lack municipal ordinances just generally exclusively rely upon the state statutes for that. Which I know now you're asking the question, what does it matter? Well, it matters apparently for money, or so I'm told. So this is the Michigan Municipal League, and they put out a pamphlet to help educate municipalities in terms of how they can maximize revenue through the distribution of fines and costs through municipal prosecution. And so the fact that you have a bunch of dollar signs that are up here shows you exactly where the agency happens to be in here. This is about money. And what it turns out is if you file it according to an ordinance, the municipality that the district court is in gets a cut of that money directly into their general fund. If you file it under the state statute rather than a municipal ordinance, the district does not get the money. Rather, it goes to a library fund. So what you're essentially having here is a shift away from funds going into libraries, and you're redirecting that funds into your general fund as a means to hopefully balance that out in that regard. When you put all three of those together, that ultimately becomes a pattern of social interactions that are really becoming very, very prevalent within contemporary American society, particularly within northern cities that have not really dealt with its legacy of segregation all that well. So what we're seeing then is at first demographic changes that still maintain segregated communities, and you lack social integration that creates idealized or class consciousness. It's us versus them, and nobody really has a set of experiences to be able to go across those boundaries. Particularly in the inner ring suburbs, like places like Ferguson and Wyoming and Kentwood, what you're seeing now is that those demographic changes are lagging behind power structure changes. So despite the fact that now these communities have a substantial non-white population, those non-white populations lack any voice whatsoever upon city councils and upper management. That lack of voice is not necessarily problematic unless you have that distrust that comes in there. If there's no good job in sort of creating that degrees of channels and conversations and voice, now you run into the problem where people now start distrusting you. And what you have then is that distrust, and these isolated communities allow alternative or hidden transcripts to become much more prevalent. And the more disconnected they are from power structures, the more overtly antagonistic hidden transcripts will be against power structures. And so that really is the issue where you started getting a loss of consent and challenges to the legitimacy of authority is because of that lack of dialogue. And then what you do is you create stress that is acting upon those already existing fissures that are built into the social fabric of our particular communities. And so what you do is you create distrust, you create the vibrant, active, hidden transcripts that are providing alternative narratives that are challenging that hegemonic authority. And what they start doing is challenging legitimacy of powers, particularly when those get stressed through very, very aggressive police actions. And that ultimately is the reason why Ferguson blew up the way it was. It had a little bit to do in terms of the proximal cause of the shooting of Michael Brown, but really the shooting of Michael Brown was just simply the match that sort of lit the firestorm. This is the tinder that ultimately caused that unrest. The key thing for us is this is an emerging phenomenon in US history. This is not something that's going away. This is a phenomenon that's increasing in importance in the particular communities that most of us happen to live in, because it's not just Ferguson, but it's also Wyoming and Kentwood. That the same processes that ultimately led to strife there are the same processes that are going on in hundreds and hundreds of different inner-ring suburbs throughout all of these different northern cities. And so without addressing that particular emerging phenomenon, what you're likely to see then would be another phase of US history that would be similar to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where you have growing and growing unrest that is allowing these hidden transcripts now to be forced into a public realm where they're now contesting more dominant public transcripts. And that contestation then is really creating the seeds for outbreaks of violence, which I'm sure everybody in here would like to avoid. And that ultimately is what we're trying to do, is avoid violence. So one of the things that we need to do is stop the first one, which is figuring out ways to better integrate communities across racial and ethnic lines. We do that terribly here. Establishment of civic institutions, particularly in inner-ring suburbs, where there's got to be a concerted effort on the part of not just existing power structures to reach out to and establish civic institutions that allow not just one community, but all communities that are a member of a particular municipality to have a degree of voice. And then another one would be another simple one that I have no power over, which would be the changing some sort of allocation of fines and forfeitures to really diffuse the tension that comes from the use of those particular active policings, and instead use much more of a complete community-based policing strategy. So you take away the distrust, you create an opportunities for voice, and you integrate communities better that allow them to diffuse those particular tensions. And those would be very, very simple ones that ultimately would help us sort of check some degree of emerging sort of strife or contentiousness that would emerge recently in sort of the United States society. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone around and you can ask a question.
I answered them all.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Would you care to comment on the role of neighborhood associations in our local community and their importance in curbing the threat of this type of unrest that appears to have erupted not only in Ferguson but elsewhere in the country?
Yeah, neighborhood associations would be a good context, unless a lot of these solutions can be enacted. But I mean, you could look at it as being a double-edged sword, so to speak, where on one hand, neighborhood associations really creates that local context. And that's ultimately where we're seeing his need to sort of enact at local lived contexts solutions that help break that down. The question of how neighborhood associations get formed and how those immediate, again, influences in those neighborhood associations becomes the question then, because what you can have is a neighborhood association forming, but the lines of that association then essentially being drawn along existing social boundaries. And so what you're doing then is just re-entrenching an already existing problem, as opposed to sort of creating a local context in which that problem can be solved in. So possibly but there also is a big sort of danger to that as well.
Could you elaborate on white flight and some of the perceptions from whites or higher, I guess a higher class as it is, of perceptions of violence or perceptions of crime in lower income or minority communities?
Yeah, ultimately, like when you talk to individuals, that tends to be tends to be a big driving factor. If you looked in Chicago, in the history of Chicago and the neighborhood busting that went on, that would occur is particularly on the margins of the urban Chicago area, is that you had predominantly white communities, and what real estate agents would do would be paying an African-American individual to walk down the streets with a baby stroller. And what that was doing was whipping up fear into that particular community, where real estate agents could then buy up properties on a cheaper level because that panic was reducing property values. And then what you could do is you could turn around and flip it, and you could sell it to non-white residents on land contracts, and that you can actually make a fairly sizable turnover in that regard. So fear tends to be sort of the driving factor. When you look at the statistics, as long as you're not out at 2:30 in the morning hanging around with sort of nefarious individuals, chances are you're going to be somewhat safe in there. With that said, I'm not going to sort of second guess anybody's decision to look out for what's best for their particular families and their children, particularly schools, becomes sort of one of the biggest sort of drivers with that. But I think if a lot of people would take the time to really sit down and think about how those issues are really impacting that, what they'll realize is that those fears tend to be based more on an absence of information than it does on any concrete sort of perception. And what ends up happening then is as you have flight that declines property values, and then as you decline property values, you create a persistent cycle of impoverishment in local neighborhoods, and that what we recognize is that crime primarily corresponds with income rather than any other demographic factor. So it tends to be a self-fulfilling issue in there. So it's not to say that white flight is necessarily bad. That just tends to be the term that sort of people put onto that. But that is a dynamic that really is one of those ultimate causes of some of those issues. But that's a good question.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk, and I think it was an excellent example of a sort of structure-based explanation about certain event, which I can argue is a sort of a dominant hegemonic narrative in the field of anthropology.
Anthropologists like structure. So.
But in the media, these events were portrayed sort of agent-based. They were sort of portrayed as a drama between personalities, different groups. How would you respond to these portrayals? Why would you say that these portrayals were perhaps wrong, or they missed the point, or didn't really explain what happened?
What Professor Vrujik is talking about is concepts in social theory between structure and agency. Structures are these broad social structures that are influencing sort of the way in which individuals act. Your ability to act freely as a free-willed individual is your agency. And so what ends up happening then is you have this dialogue between structure and agency, which is at the core of the question there. What I've been primarily looking at is structural factors that are governing how not just agents are acting themselves, but how they're perceiving the outcomes of their particular actions. Yet when you look at the media, what the media likes to do is they like to focus on individuals because that's part of the rhetoric of journalism, that you have the story, and that story has to be grounded in humans. And so what you're looking at then are individual agent responses. How you answer that really depends on which body of social theory you come from. So if you talk to somebody who is a very much of a structural determinist, that agents are a product of their structures, and we're just kind of going about as puppets in here. On the other hand, that some people say that agency is what produces structures and the negotiation that, yet we all still are conditioned in terms of our behavior. So what likely is the truth is that there's some sort of interplay in there, on there. And so do I believe in a very, very strong structurally determinate line on here? Not necessarily, and I'm usually much more in the middle. But what I tend to do, particularly in these talks, is illustrate much more of the structural factors, in part because I feel like in contemporary media coverage is that what ends up happening is a disproportionate emphasis on agents and agency And really, if you read Bourdieu and sort of practice theory, it's the agents and you exerting your agency is what maintains, contests, and reformulates those structures itself. So that would be your body of social theory for the day. Good question.
How does all this play into the violence that broke out there and the groups of people that joined that had no connection besides the media to the area?
I wasn't there.
Yeah, but there was just huge violence.
There is huge violence, but I think what ends up happening is a lot of people, particularly in media accounts, is a good thing in terms of hegemony, in terms of if you listen to the narrative that was being put forth through the police and the city management, is what they tended to say is Ferguson residents are nice, peaceful demonstrators. The problem is these outside agitators. And so what ends up happening then as you build up that idea then is that you have a protest that is largely all these different random people from all over the place that are running to Ferguson to set stuff on fire. I don't know how true that is, because if you talk to protesters and the people that actually are there, what words come out of their mouth is, these are the 50 people that are here every night, and they all live in the neighborhood in here. And so what you're having then are two different transcripts. A public transcript being altered by positions of dominance or power. The hegemonic ideal is that it's really not a local problem, it's all these outside people that are coming in causing the difficulty. The contesting narrative then is this is a local issue and it's local people that are primarily dealing with that. I don't know how to answer that because I literally have no lived experience. I don't know the individuals there in there. I find it curious that you have such diametrically opposed narratives in there. And so that becomes, I think, an issue that is going to need, I think, a lot of more reflexive thought. So it's a very, very good issue I think you're highlighting. And it's a key part of the contestation of narratives in there. And so I think it's an illustration of the hegemony and sort of the counter-hegemony that's going on in the public and private transcripts in there. I just don't have a good answer for you, to be honest.
One thing that might be instructive is to look at the history of the civil rights movement, because in the South, at the height of the civil rights movement, the same arguments were made that it wasn't the local population that had a problem with the way things used to be, because they were always happy. It's all these outsiders that came in that gave people an improper notion about how to live. So that would be a good place to look to start to try to understand how that dynamic works. I think it's a way of undermining it. Yeah.
Good. Thanks very much. That's why we need historians hanging around.
You were talking about black representation within civic institutions, so like the city council. Mm-hmm. How do the two black commissioners explain the growing racial disparities and gentrification in Grand Rapids?
I would defer you to them, to be honest. So I think they would probably explain it similar to what I am, but I'm not going to put any words in their mouths with that. So I think what you end up having then is gentrification and the racial disparities in them really becomes, again, a class-based issue, which I was trying to illustrate here, is that what you're having then is sort of a dance to some extent between social classes. As one moves into an area and pushes others out and displaces them, that's creating a homogenous community in itself. And then over time that breaks down and then somebody else comes in there. So I think the same exact dynamics that I was illustrating here are the same local phenomena at play. I think the commissioners, particularly from the Third Ward, I think are very, very aware of that, particularly on that boundary in the southern end of Heritage Hill and the black community in there, recognizing that becomes an issue. How specifically that they'll talk about sort of dealing with that in their own communities. I can't speak for them. So I think that's another very, very good question that I don't have a good answer for to illustrate. So I'm here for no solution whatsoever. It's no answers. But I'm actually encouraged that people are asking the right questions. You can't get the right answers without asking the right questions. So I would encourage you to actually go talk to Commissioners Lumpkins and Lerner for that, unless you know the answer specifically. All right, good question.
Was the white flight something that's indoctrined into that group in that race? And nowadays, since there are more races coming to America, I mean, Europeans, I mean, you have Latinos, is that going to be something more prominent than just black people?
Race is a social construct, which you'll learn about after the next exam, since Jonathan's in my class. I think what you're seeing is all of these are not like everybody's sitting around on the same Facebook page getting together to say, all right, we're all moving here. A lot of the issue, particularly James Scott's work with hidden and private transcripts and very, very cautious forms of resistance, the main focus point of that is that they're uncoordinated. And their strength really in terms of a weapon of the weak is their lack of coordination. The same thing occurs in terms of dominant narratives as well, that you don't have some sort of elite pulling puppet strings, but because individuals primarily talk to other individuals with similar experiences, that the narratives that they settle on tend to be homogeneous and cohesive. And so I talk to such and such, I talk to such and such, and rumors or transcripts spread, and then once those transcripts get universally accepted within a community, they get sort of established as that dominant transcript. The issue then between public and private transcripts is whose transcript, whose version of events? Is this outside agitators or is this local protest? Whose version of events gets to be the official narrative? And the official narrative then is usually the one individuals occupying a position of power in there. But really what you're resulting is not really a coordinated event per se, or a coordinated sort of activity, but what you see then are these emerging sorts of phenomenons, ideas that no one individual has any control over. So.
Okay, moving to, I guess, more of a broader perspective of it all. Social media plays such a large part in today's world with Twitter, Facebook, MySpace, if anyone still uses that.
I should have put a hashtag for my talk.
Yeah, you should have, yeah.
I'm a Luddite. So.
I guess you see a lot of times now with social media, we're more connected to what's going on in the world, all these problems in the world that's going on, but sometimes it turns into something like almost like a flash, like we'll all be paying attention to it and then it'll just die out. Like the whole Coney thing. I guess with Ferguson, is it more of a learning? Are we going to be able to keep this around and learn from it, make it kind of a chapter that we can learn from, or is it just going to fade away, in your opinion?
In terms of I think, social media and hashtag activism, I think, like you're saying, is that short attention spans can sort of cause problems in there. So I think it's actually curious that you still have individuals that are standing in the street and the parking lot across from Ferguson City Hall. They're probably not tweeting about that very much in there. So I think maybe some of the issues that you were talking about were at play in there. As you get this big, huge public sort of movement because it's all over social media, then people get excited about it, they show up, and then they tend to dissipate. And the more enduring protest, the more enduring counter sort of protest then becomes something that is grounded in local communities and tends to be locally based. We see that pretty much with any movement out there, is that it has to have local connections in order to sustain it in there. Because if you have any sort of social movement that has a much more of an ephemeral type of thing, what tends to happen then is that tends to break down very, very quickly. And so I think yes and no. I think it's the role of social media to sort of create the spark that really sort of made it an important event. I think was necessary. I think it was helpful to really sort of create a broader sort of national consciousness for a local issue. But I think the sustainability of that particular protest is going to be having to bear out in a local context as opposed to a national media sense. And so I think you see the same thing with the Arab Spring stuff as well, where a lot of individuals got their idea and sort of involvement in the movement in general was through a lot of social media, particularly in the Arab Muslim communities. But ultimately the sustainability of protests, really the on the ground deciding to pick up arms and challenge al-Assad's regime in Syria or challenged Gaddafi's regime in Libya, those often were borne out in terms of very, very local or context. In Libya, it was essentially the rural warlords and the ethnic groups that were playing out, again, a local identity that was sustaining this, even though that the immediate sense of it was a flashpoint of social media. So I think what you're going to see then is probably a lot of that. And it becomes a neat dynamic then that as a broader sort of global consciousness that people tend to act globally and think globally, we'll have a lot of those ephemeral flashpoints and they'll grab hold of people's attention for a while and then dissipate. And ultimately what you're going to still doing is seeing, to answer Gordon's question, even though he's left, is local agency really being the driving force then in terms of challenging structural change. So,
We have time for one more question, I think.
There's social stratification in every place in the world, for the most part. But are there any examples or nations that are analogous to the United States, kind of like ancient Rome is analogous to some of the situations we find ourselves in the United States? But is there anything regarding this topic?
comparable things?
Yeah.
Yeah, Europe's blowing up. So basically, our history is one of our particular social construction of race, but you still see the same unrest that's occurring in a lot of neighborhoods, predominantly France would be another good example in terms of nationalistic French, which would be an ethnic identity, and immigrants primarily from former French colonies in North Africa that are really creating a very, very distinctive sort of separation. I think the same exact demographic things where people move into neighborhoods, but those neighborhoods are really becoming physically isolated from one another. And then as groups continue to become marginalized and lack that voice, that increases the amount of strife. So you actually see this type of thing over and over and over again, both in an industrialized context in here. So I think if you look at any sort of episodes that are occurring in Europe, probably the last 5 years, that you'll see the exact same issues at play in here. A lot of the issues or the sets of theory that I drew from are actually done in sort of peasant context in parts of Southeast Asia, that you see changing relationships in terms of landowner and peasant tenant farmers as those change and sort of the different sort of struggle. And so those types of activities will pretty much show up globally in that respect. Like you said, everybody more or less is now tied into more or less a state in some way, and states by definition have some degree of social stratification. In part because you have elites that maintain a monopoly on power, and you have subordinates that are struggling against that particular power. Our specific experiences here in the States are unique in one respect, in that it's our own history of population movements and our own history of the social construction of race that's really unique. Like you don't see those types of relationships in other cultural contexts. But the same issues then, all you do is you change the actors then in there, not to get too structurally deterministic. You adjust the actors, but they're essentially struggling over the same sort of challenges in there. So, in one hand, we're unique. On the other hand, it's a pattern that we see consistently.